What's going to make the difference editorially are those people who decided not to try and do everything at once. They're not going to try to do the news today and what it means and what's going to happen next. I think we're going to see a certain balkanization happen, whereby there will be stations or there will be websites and stations who will decide not to just be the boys and girls on the bus, but rather they'll devote all of their time to what it means.
Peter Chaplin, thank you very much for joining us on TV News, Insights, and Ideas for the Future. For 45 years, you've been a TV producer for ABC and CBS and at major markets around the country. You also teach a multi-platform journalism course of storytelling at the Scripps School of Journalism at the Ohio University Academy of Art University in San Francisco. A big mouthful for saying you are an experienced producer and journalism professor. What would you tell your students today is the current, in 2017, the current state of TV news?
I think the current state of TV news is conflicted and trying to find its way, trying to find an audience. Just look at the advertisers who take the network news slots every evening. It's a pretty limited bunch. Television news, as you and I know it, the good old days, are gone. And audiences have changed, audiences' tastes have changed, and the way audiences view television and television news has changed. So the question kind of comes up, will there still be a television news program, perhaps as we know it, or as we knew it? Yes, perhaps so, but the stories are going to be shorter. There certainly are not going to be 3 or 4 major networks. And within any major market television station, it's unlikely that you'll have 4, 5, or 6 channels all competing at the same hours. So the market for television news is shrinking. That does not mean that the appetite for stories is diminished.
On the internet.
On the internet and all kinds of different platforms on the internet. It might be phones, it might be tablets, any number of things. But it's not necessarily that 55-inch screen hanging on your wall and mine.
Do you think there's a way that TV news moving forward, say in the next 5, 10, 20 years, can remain relevant and competitive with the most competitive place on earth, which is the internet?
Yeah, I think it can, and I think you'll see even more competition from the internet doing what you and I would call television news, whether it's Vox or Vice or Mike or Medium, local stations, network stations, CBSN. Yeah, by all means, I'm in that sense, I'm upbeat. I think there will be a market for television news on the internet. The stories will be different. And we'll see different ways of storytelling. I mean, a year ago, we were very excited about virtual reality. And yet that seems now to have almost been last year's pet rock. The next thing we hear a lot about is augmented reality. I think that will be something interesting to see. How we use it in storytelling, also not yet entirely clear. But yes, absolutely, Mike. I think there will be news stories and people get their information electronically and they want audio and video to do it. But they're watching differently. And that's one of the most important keys. If you look at some recent studies, one from Nielsen, it showed that 40% of the millennial audience up to, say, 34, they watch with the sound turned off. Facebook, just last month, February 2017, came out with a survey that said 85% of its viewers watch with the sound turned off. And yet we all know that so many millennials say Facebook is their primary source of news. Well, it's one thing to watch a pet video with the sound turned off. Very different if you're watching news or information with the sound turned off. That's going to pose a challenge to all of us as storytellers.
All right.
How do you get the audience's attention in that first 3 seconds? And then how do you support that? Do you use a screenshot? What do you do? And that's what still remains to be determined.
Which brings us to the point of ideas for the future. What do you think, and the future could be tomorrow, and it could be 20 years from now.
The future is an hour from now. We used to speak of second day leads. Let's talk about second hour.
So how can TV compete with the internet? What techniques can it either adapt from the internet or come up with its own? I mean, speaking for myself, I haven't seen any visionaries in television news, truly visionary people, since Roone Arledge. And his vision probably lasted only a few years in the terms of its novelty because things move so quickly.
I'd answer that two ways. The first is I'd say what made Roone great, and I got to work for him, was that he was a visionary in the business sense. And he was surrounded by others like Roger Goodman, who were visionaries as directors and in the programming sense. I think we do have visionaries today whose work is yet to be entirely embraced or understood. I'm thinking of Jeff Bezos, of course, at Washington Post and Amazon. I think that's going to be a huge change in the way people get their information. The first part of your question in terms of how to do it from a television news perspective, you co-opt the internet. You co-opt what everyone else is doing. It's no accident that reporters say at KGO Channel 7, the ABC owned and operated station in San Francisco, part of their contract renewal is predicated on not just their popularity, but how well they tell stories on Twitter, how well they embrace and engage audiences both during the show and after the show, and hold on to that audience or seed. That's sort of a corporate term. How do you seed a story in order, by that I simply mean you present the story, but maybe you save a soundbite and you put that out on social media later in order to seed or encourage the conversation and draw people back to the original piece. You know, gee whiz, 10 years ago people would speak of convergence. And convergence basically meant, well, if you'd like to hear the entire interview we did with Mike Lee, go to the internet to our site. That was convergence. That is convergence now with a small c. Convergence with steroids means you use the internet as part of the platforms that you tell your stories on, and you try to entice people to come to your TV station as well.
Well, that all amounts to clever adapting of techniques
Yes.
that are on the internet that were not originated by television. What I don't see, and I haven't heard yet, is any vision about how television can either reinvent itself, and by that I don't mean just little tiny techniques, but come up with something truly different that can be relevant in its own space, as opposed to just trying to chase after the internet.
I don't know if we've come to that a clear answer on that, because I might have said a year and a half ago, television could go live in ways that the internet didn't. Now we have Facebook Live. Now we have Periscope, which it almost is passe itself. You no longer need a TV station to go live. So TV as a news entity is going to have to become better storytellers. They're going to have to give the context, the background that simply a live shot doesn't do. I've even done it for networks. Have ended up using my iPhone in order to feed a network program. Feeding live is not much of a challenge. When we began, it was loops and lines being put into stations, then satellites and Vivex. All of that is now still there, but it's no longer as dominant as it once was. Anybody could go live, but not everyone can tell a story. And simply by putting the pictures up is not in itself storytelling, is not in itself giving the context or the meaning or that really good interview with somebody who's a principal to the story has to offer. And that's what comes back to editing. If you look at the great television news programs of the past, and let's go back to Murrow and Fred Friendly, or go back to Cronkite, whoever you want to go back to, what made those programs great was the editing. And the stories were complete and they were well told.
But what I don't see is the oldest form of storytelling that could not be used in the old form of TV news, could be used in the new form, and could especially be used on digital, which is built-in, natural, organic suspense. And if you want somebody to follow your story, your original story, assume that you can come up with an original idea that the New York Times didn't come up with already. And don't tell me as a producer you didn't run up against that, because I'm sure you did.
All the time.
But what I would like to see happen is for news organizations that want to survive and have something visionary of their own that sets them apart and keeps them relevant or makes them relevant, is the ability to carry people with you from day to day when you follow a story. And you cannot do that unless you create some kind of suspense and intrigue that is organic within the story. Now, the reason it hasn't happened to now is that television, time-wise, could never afford to do it. It had to move on to something new the next day. But on the internet, that's entirely possible. Storytelling on the internet is not yet doing that. So if you're out there and you want something really different, look at that concept, and then you'll stand out.
I think what you're speaking about two parallel tracks. We have the technology, and then we have the editorial side of the storytelling. The technology has gotten to the point where it's a jumble, and where it's really dominated mostly by noise and the belief that we have to do something new. Our stick-to-itiveness on any given story can be measured with a thimble, and that's unfortunate. And it's also unfortunate because everyone is basically doing the same thing. What's going to make the difference editorially are those people who decided not to try and do everything at once. They're not going to try to do the news today and what it means and what's going to happen next. I think we're going to see a certain balkanization happen, whereby there will be stations or there will be websites and stations who will decide not to just be the boys and girls on the bus, but rather they'll devote all of their time to what it means. And I think there might be another group of people, stations and organizations, who will then be doing stories of what to look for next. And I think that's how they're going to differentiate themselves. They're not going to try to be all things to all people, doing it all together, because that's not differentiation, that's homogenization. And that's not terribly inventive storytelling. That's really the hits, runs, and errors, point a camera at it and tell me what's going on. But if you really want to get to what people speak of immersive television, we haven't really quite gotten to that part of storytelling. Some of us thought that would be involved with VR, and to a degree there's some very interesting experiments, but not sustainable. So then the question becomes, how would you, if you were a TV executive, I think you're asking me this question, how would I position myself to differentiate myself? I would try to form an identity in the audience of something that they can need and they can use. Here in San Francisco, we have one station which has put a lot of its eggs in the basket of being the investigative station. Much the same way when you and I were younger, we had the eyewitness news, the crime, whatever it was. Now it's a little bit more substantive of investigative. I think we're going to see, as I mentioned, people who are going to say, we aren't going to worry just about what's going on, but rather we're going to tell you what it means and how you can use it. I think you'll see some storytelling breakouts there.
Peter Shaplen, thank you very much for joining us on TV News, Insights, and Ideas for the Future. Former ABC and CBS producer and journalism professor. Thank you very much.
Mike, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
The issues are profound and urgent, solutions critical to a free society. If you believe that you can contribute insights and ideas for the future of video news, we'd like to hear from you. You might have the next big vision. Book your Skype interview by emailing me, mikeleenews @mac.com. mikeleenews@mac.com. TV News, Insights and Ideas is a not-for-profit project by Mike Lee. It is not limited to any one news organization. Newsmakers are also invited to submit insights and ideas. Bring your game.